Greetings, everybody. We're back with Sanat Kumar explaining things to Pr14. So Sanat Kumar says, Pr14's question is, we suffer because we are interested in things that are outside of ourselves. So therefore we have to work really hard to get such things. And we become reliant on things that we can't control. So we suffer because of our absorption in external things. But how can we change that at all? Because we're not aware of anything except external things. All of our senses are designed to perceive external things. Things which happen or occur. Even your emotions are things which are occurring in the field of perception. They aren't actually a part of consciousness itself. They're something which consciousness observes. So that's his question. If all of our problems are caused by the fact that we're reliant upon external conditions, but how could we ever change that when we don't have any ability to perceive anything except external conditions? Sanat Kumar says that's a great question. And he says what you need to, what you need to do is lose attachment for external things. But how is that possible? If that's all you can perceive, you have to start to hear about something which is not extrinsic to the consciousness itself. You have to ultimately gain a deep, strong attachment, just as the most passionate person has for their most passionate objective. You have to have that same kind of passionate attachment ultimately to the inner root of consciousness. But it begins by at least hearing about consciousness itself and what its qualities are, where it comes from, what it's rooted in. And to do that, you need to... So then there's some follow-up questions to that. How does that happen? That happens in the company of people who know something about consciousness and the root. And then another follow-up question is, how come it doesn't always work? Doesn't seem to work. If it worked, you could just broadcast on a loudspeaker information about consciousness and people would all get enlightened. But it doesn't work that way because people pay attention to things. Or don't pay attention to things and therefore understand or don't understand things. Or we also understand the way Mercury works is you understand by pattern matching. That's why Mercury is great with patterns. So intellect works by pattern matching. If you get new information in that you don't have the proper patterns to understand, you'll match it with other patterns that you do have. So when you hear spiritual information, you'll match it with material comprehensions and concepts. So you won't really understand it deeply. So Sanat Kumar's answer to that question was, therefore you have to put in some work to remove the misconceptions, which are basically, which are called anarthas or aparats, which prevent you from absorbing the spiritual information. If you absorb spiritual information, then you'll be able to perceive spiritual reality because your perception is based on your information. But there's a prevention to absorbing things that you don't understand. So you have to work to get rid of the misconceptions in order so that you can get the proper conceptions. And because the misconceptions boil down to the self being the central figure in reality, you engage in activity. It's not brain work. The removal of misconceptions isn't brain exercise or mental gymnastics. It's actual practical activity. Acting, the way that it begins, when you're saturated in a lack of knowledge, the way that you begin to get knowledge is not through your brain. It's through your action. So if you start to act in the way that a person with knowledge would act, even if you don't know why. That's how we learn things. How does a child learn how to walk? Your parent actually moves the hips You move the legs. You show the child. Child has no idea what you're talking about. Why are you moving my hips like this? Why are you pushing my feet around? He doesn't even know. But he cooperates and he tries to emulate it, and then all of a sudden it starts to make more and more sense because he gets rid of other ways of acting, other ways of the muscles moving, and it shows them the right way to move. So, very important to being able to understand spiritual knowledge is to first engage in spiritual or religious or progressive action. This is why Karma Yoga is the foundation for Jnana Yoga. And then that's why Jnana Yoga is the foundation for Bhakti Yoga. People think that there are three separate kinds of paths. Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga. Nothing could be more untrue. There are three phases of development on the path. The one path of yoga has three major phases to it. The first phase is karma, or active action, where you're trying to emulate the way that enlightened people act, which is non-selfish. Even though it's not natural or you don't comprehend the significance of it, you do it anyway. So you practice something like not killing other people. Basic, right? Or not killing things unnecessarily. You practice vegetarianism. Or you practice maintaining your family, taking care of your kids. All these kind of basic things that are a part of society since the most ancient memories are there so that people emulate the actions that you would perform if you were intellect, if you did have an intellect that worked. Because by doing the actions, you inform the intellect. Then you can comprehend things intellectually more than you can go to Jnana Yoga. Okay, so that's what Sanat Kumar answered so far. King said, how can we get out of the situation where we're investing all of our time and energy in external things? Sanat Kumar said, you have to become attached to the internal reality. How can you do that when you can't perceive the internal reality? Sanat Kumar said, you can hear about it, get information about it, then you'll be able to perceive it after you have information about it. King said, how can we hear about it properly? I've heard about it many times, I still can't perceive it. Sanat Kumar says you have to have no misconceptions about how you receive the information. Therefore, you have to engage in pious activity, good actions. So that's where we're up to now. Any questions about that bit? What Sanat Kumar has answered so far? I'm gonna only answer questions that are. I'm in a annoyed mood today. I'm annoyed with the world today. So I'm not in a tolerant mood. So I'm just gonna ignore off-topic questions if you don't mind. Galibji says, how do you find a guru in Kali Yuga? Same way you find it in any yuga, except that they're far less abundant. Guru is not magic, hocus pocus stuff. How do you find a pair of underwear? It's the same way you find a guru. First you think about what kind of underwear you want. Then you go shopping for it. And then you compare the underwear that you see with the underwear that you want. And you see if this underwear has the qualities of the thing that you want. And if it does, you buy it. It's the same way you find a guru. Also, to make the analogy even a little bit less distant, how do you find a piano teacher? You think about the qualities that you want to have in your piano playing, and then you go and see what teachers are available, and you see which one has the closest thing to the quality that you want to have and seems capable of teaching you and willing to teach you, and you take lessons from that person. It's no different. If you want to know about Bhagavan, you think about the way that you want to know about Bhagavan. How would you like to have a relationship with the ultimate reality? And you find a person that has some comprehension of that. And then you engage in questioning. Let's see what else we got. Thanks, Mary. How's the Diksha wants to know how's karma yoga to be followed? Everybody has different karmas based on their dharmas. In English, that means everybody has different proper actions based on what their nature is, or their condition is. So, for example, if you're a child and you have, it's obvious. It's also obvious. It's as obvious as shopping for underwear. If you're a cook, your karma is to cook. If you're a mother, your karma is to mother. If you're a father, your karma is to father. If you're a student, your karma is to study. It's basically like that. So just assess all the things that you are, and then turn it into a verb form and get those things done well, and you're doing your good karmas. If music is telling me not to be annoyed, you can't tell a person not to be annoyed. It only makes them more annoyed. Also, you guys should stop being so judgmental. What's wrong with being annoyed? Aren't there valid things to be annoyed with? You know why I'm annoyed? Because I just looked at the news this morning, and I'm thinking about the world. Only an idiot would not be annoyed. All right. Let's go now. Let's see the next part. Sorry for the self-centered diversions. I'm also annoyed with myself. Constant annoyance, which follows one from day to day. All right. Now the king's new question is, if we do this, if we do karma yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga, if we clarify our misconceptions, get rid of our misconceptions, then receive transcendental knowledge, and then fall in love with the root of internal reality, then what happens? Sanat smiled out of satisfaction with the king's eagerness to hear more on the subject. And then he answered, when we fall firmly in love with that transcendent being, then, if we also have an experienced guide, that love will produce very powerful knowledge and disinterest in all other things. Now, you can also see this in everyday affairs in love. Well, while you're in love with Pac-Man, then you're not particularly interested in Galaga. I don't know how many people have these references still in their vocabulary. While you're in love with Galaga, you're not that interested in playing Pac-Man. So that's why the term is vairagya. Vairagya, the term for detachment, actually is a compound of the word for attachment. Ragya means attachment. And so it's actually attachment to one thing which produces detachment from the other thing. That's why if you want to be detached from the things which are making you weak and struggle and unhappy, then you have to be attached to the things that are making it's something else, to something that won't do that. If you have a bad relationship with one person, you have to get a good relationship with somebody else before you'll actually forget about the bad relationship with that other person. So he says, when we fall firmly in love with that transcendent being, then, if we also have an experienced guide, that love will produce very powerful knowledge and disinterest in all other things. This knowledge and disinterest will weaken the power of the 5 things that obscure our soul, burning them away like fire destroying its own source. Burning them away like fire destroying its own source. So because this is an emotional, this is attachment destroying attachments. This is probably the origin of the fight fire with fire. I never really understood how do you fight fire with fire. But fire will eventually burn out its own fuel. So fire actually eventually kills itself. So what he's saying here is, this is a way of letting attachment make you detached. By being attached to B, you become detached from A. So if your goal is detachment from A, then become detached to B, then become attached to B. That's the thing. People want to know how to get off drugs. That's how you get off drugs. Get into beer. People want to know how you get away from alcohol. That's how you get away from alcohol. Get into something else. Get into sex. People want to know how you get away from sex. Stop your addiction to sex. Get into something else. Get into beer. Get into music. Get into something. Whatever you have, passion as part of your very nature. Now, you can't change that. That's part of your nature, eternal nature. But you can you choose what object it's going to fall upon. And if you can find out that there's a transcendent object that it could fall upon, then your passion could lead you out of mundane conditions. And this way, the fire of the passion, which was causing the burning, is now consuming its own source instead. Then he says there's these 5 things that obscure the soul. So the footnote on that is, the 5 things are ignorance, selfish ambition, attachment, aversion, and fear. When these things are burnt away, we become emancipated from all our external attractions. So actually the external attractions, therefore, must be a result of those 5 things. And so let's think about that for a moment. Our attraction, the reason why we have passions or fears for the specific things that we have passions for, is because of these 5 things. So the lowest one is fear. So we have attachment for things that we think will protect us from the fears that we have. And also fear of losing something motivates attachment to it. If you don't have any fear, then 1/5 of your power of your attachment is gone. So for example, if you look at mothers and children, mothers are exceedingly attached to their children, hopefully. They should be. That's part of their dharma. And if you look at a mother's life, 1/5 of it is fear. She's always afraid about what's going to happen to the child. That's a part of the attachment. If you also look at attachment for Bhagavan, there'll be a transcendental form of this also. So fear is one of the things which generates attachment. And then this other pair of attachment and aversion, things that you like and things that you don't like, generate attachment. So obviously the thing that you like generates attachment to it. Like you like a particular flavor, therefore you get attached to particular foods. You like a particular type of experience, so you get attached to particular situations and objects that produce that experience. And aversion is just the opposite. You don't like certain things, so you get attached to things that prevent that. Like aspirin. Or medicine. A lot of people are addicted to medicine. Or drugs. It's a mix of both attachment and aversion. Then going down lower, the 2 remaining things are ignorance and self-ambition, avidya and ahankara. Self-ambition is what causes the aversion, attachment, and fear. So actually, attachment and the 5 things are sequential. Fear is the end product. The end product is our attachment to the world. Fear is the final motivator, but fear is caused by the attachment or the likes and the aversion or the dislikes, likes and dislikes. Because we have a fear of failing. If you like something, then your fear is that you'll lose it or fail to get it. And if you dislike it, then your fear is, like, nobody likes COVID. So there's fear that you'll get it. And nobody likes death. So there's fear that you'll get it. Or everybody likes health. So there's fear that you'll lose it. So in this way, attachment or likes and aversions, dislikes produce fear. And then likes and dislikes are produced by this previous item, which is ahankara, ambition. The likes or dislikes are based on your concept of who you are. So, for example, you could see that you just hang out with kids. Hanging out with kids is the most therapeutic thing to do. It also drives you nuts when you're responsible for them. But just to hang out with kids in general during the day when you have energy, that's somewhat reasonably on the same level as their infinite supply. It's really, really actually like relaxing and enlightening to hang out with kids because you can see behavior so obvious. It's not masked. Children's behavior is very unmasked. So one thing that you'll see is how one object will cause aversion to one kid and attachment to another kid. So take, like, for example, a very girly thing and offer it to a boy. And they'll go and offer it to a girl and she'll go, thank you. So that's an illustration of how the ahankara is defining the attachment and the aversion. So the sense of what you are basically defines what you like or want and what you dislike or don't want. So the root of all the attachment is our conditional sense of who we are. Conditional sense, which means it's not a true sense of what we are. It's a conditional sense. And then that reason why we have a conditional sense of who we are is because of the root cause of it all is avidya, or ignorance of who we are. So the root cause of all this stuff is ignorance. Therefore, if you get rid of the ignorance, you don't really have to work on getting rid of fear. You can't get rid of fear. Because as long as you have attachment and aversion, you'll have fear. So maybe you should get rid of attachment and aversion. But you can't. Because as long as you have a conditional sense of your identity, you'll always have attachment and conditional attachments and aversions. So maybe you should get rid of your conditional identity, but you can't. Because as long as you have ignorance of your true identity, then you won't be able to be without a conditional identity because you are a conscious being. So the I must be defined in some way. So the way to get rid of all of the roots of everything is to get rid of the self-ignorance. That's exactly what Sanat Kumar advised. When these things are burned away, we become emancipated from all our external attractions. When we cease to look at external things, then what do you see? When we cease to look, now don't forget that looking is a product of not of your eyes, but of your attention. Are you looking at this? Or are you looking at this? They're both in your field of view right now. But what you're actually seeing is what you're paying attention to, not what's in your field of view. So similarly, God is already in our field of view, but we have no attention to discern God or the divine. Instead, our attention discerns only extrinsic things which are extrinsic to God. We perceive reality without its root. So if we cease to have the information problem which causes us to perceive reality without its root, then we will begin to perceive it with its root. That's what the Sanat Kumar is going to say now. When we cease to look at external things, or when we cease to look at things extrinsically, then we instead see our inner self with your same eyes. It's in your field of view already. We just don't have the mercury, the intellect to see the pattern. Just like if you hear Chinese, if I hear Chinese, it just sounds like some crazy stream of noise because I don't have the patterns in my head to make sense out of the stream of noise. So I don't notice any of the detail in it. The previous obstructions which prevented us from seeing the supersoul within us are now gone, just as things in a dream disappear. Then the king wants Sanat Kumar to explain it a little bit more. So he continues. He says, so he's going to explain how this field of view thing works. Where you receive data through your senses, raw data about what you're seeing, about what reality is. But the way that you actually experience reality is how your Mercury, your intellect, your buddhi, interprets the data. So if the buddhi is infected with avidya, you're going to interpret the data to show you something that's not actually the way things really are. So he explains, our desires for sensual pleasure place a veil on our perceptions, causing us to see ourselves as the entity of primary importance. Because our concept of pleasure is at the root of the avidya. Our concept of pleasure, honestly, it's that it's something that happens to us. So we have a self-centric concept of pleasure. That's what he's saying. Our desires for sensual, and that makes us unable to see the most important part about reality, which is what its center is, what its root is, what its focal point is. Our desires for sensual pleasure place a veil on our perceptions, causing us to see ourselves as the entity of primary importance. This blocks us from seeing our intimate and absolute dependence on the entity of truly ultimate importance, the super self. However, when desires are burned away by love for the transcendent, that veil disappears and we no longer see ourselves as being independent from the supersoul, which is so un-American. It's so un-American to not see yourself independent. Independence Day, independent woman. Let's not be weak. Let's be independent. I'm not saying it's totally bad. You do have to become independent from certain things to become dependent on the right thing. Like if you're dependent on heroin, then you're probably not going to be able to become dependent on the supersoul. But the ultimate goal of a bhakta, of a spiritualist, is not independence, although they will sell it to you. The people who are trying to sell you spirituality are going to sell you liberation. And that's a nice word because we want liberty and freedom and independence. But a bhakta is going to sell you dasyata, which is servitorship. It's not independence, it's dependence. We are not independent. What kind of lunatic could possibly think that anyone or anything is independent when everything is completely dependent upon everything else? So that's the main problem. We no longer see ourselves as being independent from the supersoul. When the veil is in place, we see ourselves through the qualities in the veil, and therefore imagine the qualities of the veil to be integral parts of who and what we are. This gives a false impression that we are independent entities, separated from one another and from our root, the super self. So since I went on a little tirade, let me just reread this paragraph so you get the whole thing. Our desires for sensual pleasure place a veil on our perceptions, causing us to see ourselves as the entity of primary importance. This blocks us from seeing our intimate and absolute dependence on the entity of truly ultimate importance, the super self. However, when desires are burned away by love for the transcendent, that veil disappears and we no longer see ourselves as being independent from the supersoul. When the veil is in place, we see ourselves through the qualities in the veil and therefore imagine the qualities of the veil to be integral parts of who and what we are. This gives the false impression that we are independent entities separated from one another and from our root, the super self. Now the king asks with deep feeling, why does this veil hiding the true self and the super self exist in the first place? And the boy sage explains that it exists because of attraction to perceiving objects independently and externally. Because conscious entities want to perceive things this way. That's why this veil exists, to enable it. Then if you say, why do conscious entities want to perceive themselves with centrality rather than periphery? Then the answer there is there's no logic to it. It's a preference. There's no accounting for taste. It's not something which can be logically explained. And the preference exists because it's possible. Whenever there's a possibility, there's somebody who perceives it, somebody who prefers it. Wow. I think I'll stop there and see if you have any questions about this, because the next thing is cool and I would probably like to make it the focus point for tomorrow. So write down your questions if you have any questions about what we talked about. And meanwhile, I'll give you coming attraction. The king is going to want to know, the sage Sanat Kumar is saying, we lose ourselves into the veil. So like, if you're wearing a corona mask and it's tinted red, then everything that you see is going to seem to be red. So we see ourselves through the veil that we have in our perception filters. And so we think that the perception filters are integral to ourself. So we lose the ability to perceive the self because of our concentration on what the self is perceiving. So now the king, as a coming attraction for tomorrow's session, the king says, how does that happen, that the conscious entity gets sucked into the objects of experience? And he's going to give this cool analogy that it's like the way the grass on the bank of a lake causes the lake to go dry. So the same thing which nourishes something and causes it to exist also gets consumed by it. And then he's going to elaborate on what that analogy is all about. That's an interesting thing. So I think tomorrow we'll call it the loss of self. He's going to say that's the most unfortunate thing in the world. It's worse than losing $1 billion, is to lose yourself. That's a Bible thing, right? There's a good Bible quote with that. I don't know it. What profit a man if he gains the world but loses self? All right, let's see. Sweta, what should one do if one has a doubt about their teacher? I would say the first thing to do is to just ask the teacher. And then if the reply from the teacher is unconvincing or increases your doubt, you should ask some third party what their opinion is about it. And the best way to get a third party is somebody that's not partial, and also somebody who's knowledgeable on the subject that you're concerned about. Roger. Hey, Alf. Yeah, Vincent, you have a very good point. Vincent says that means that spirituality is not detachment, but attachment to the right thing. But it's the same. Attachment to one thing is detachment from the other thing, but the ultimate goal is not detachment. The ultimate goal is attachment. Do you want to be on a diet forever? You don't want to be on a diet. You want to look good. The diet is the result of your desire to look good. Nobody wants to restrict their pleasures. But because there's something that's more pleasurable, will restrict certain pleasures to gain the thing which is... So attachment to one thing is the basis of detachment from another thing and the purpose of it. But spirituality, which just focuses on detachment, doesn't attract anybody except suicidal and negative people. And cracked people. People that just hate the world. And therefore, that spirituality becomes unpopular. And therefore, if spirituality is presented only as detachment, it's going to fill up with negative people, and positive people are not going to be interested in it. Let's see what else we got here. Vincent wants to know if fear is necessary. Now, fear is not necessary. Yeah, I don't think it's necessary. But no, it's not really necessary. Let me explain to me why you think it's necessary. Go ahead, Bardo, you seem to agree. So see if you can explain your argument, why you think fear is necessary. What Vedic book do I recommend for guidance on motherhood? It's not like the Vedas are so organized like that. That's why you need a teacher. This is really why you need a teacher, because the teacher has studied all the Vedas and knows how to apply things to different circumstances. There's no Vedic book on mothering. There's no Vedic, there's not books dedicated to this subject, but the information is spread throughout many, many different books. The simple answer is mothering is all about love. Everything is all about love. So love the child. Always make all your actions motivated by love for the child. There's no answer to the why question, Davana, because it's a preference. It's not a logical choice. Is attachment to Dharma good? Anil says, yeah, it's the beginning of good attachment. Because Dharma is the beginning of bhakti. How do we say your name? Graziella. Is the veil also necessary to enjoy experiences and exercise of karma? The veil is necessary to enjoy conditional experiences, which are not actually enjoyable, and only give you sore throats. So, let's see what other questions we got. I have no idea what Deuce is asking about. Melissa, get a big earthquake in California? Shalini Lal says, Gita says to do action without attachment to the fruits of action. How to do one's dharma, say, as a parent without attachment to its child. No. Gita says to do action without attachment to the fruits of the action. Why are you saying to be a parent without attachment to your child? That's not action without attachment to the fruits of the action. The fruit of the action is whether or not your child grows up to be the doctor or lawyer or whatever that you want them to be. Yeah. All right. So, in other words, action without attachment to the result is proper karma. So, for example, with raising a child, you do your best for the child, and you realize that the actual results are out of your control. It's dependent on your child's karma, and it's dependent on your child's choices. It's not all in your hands. So don't invest everything into the result. Invest in what is in your control, which is your effort. Vincent says, I think fear is necessary because it holds us in a way to each other against forces. So, for example, criminals, when there's a powerful king, criminals are afraid to come out into the world, right? So that fear that the criminals have is a good thing. And like a Barney, Mugga, they regulate by fear. Fear is not necessary. Fear is a tool that can be employed to achieve certain ends. If you realize that fear is what generates attachment, and if you can manipulate people's fears, then you can manipulate people. And if you need to manipulate people, then fear is necessary. But fear is not really necessary. You shouldn't try to have fear, or you shouldn't try to have fear, and you also shouldn't try to use fear. Mary wants to know if there's another text about Bhakti Yoga. Just hear the Bhagavatam for now. This Bhakti Dasyata. It's not a text. It's Dasyata means the state of service. I think that's what you're talking about. Dalvana is coming back to the question about why the veil of ignorance exists in the first place. The reason why the veil of ignorance exists in the first place is to facilitate a perception which is not real. Say, for example, I want to feel like a young kid. Or, right? Then it's not really good for me to go in front of... This is my whole thing with the glasses. Remember that little glasses statement that I made? If you want to have a great complexion, then don't wear glasses. Because when you put on your glasses, all of a sudden you see, oh my God, look at that. It's cracked, and there's a pimple, and there's hairs growing out over here. When you don't have your glasses on, it looks, look how beautiful that complexion is. I look great. Not a single wrinkle. So the ignorance there is facilitating the perception that you want. If you want to be a great basketball star, then go to the court, play basketball, and imagine yourself in the middle of a stadium. It's not really a stadium, but you have a facility to imagine it. That facility is the ignorance of the veil, which is not allowing you to see that you're alone on a playground. So the veil exists. It's a function of the mind that enables consciousness to perceive what it wants to perceive. Now, then the question would be, the follow-up question is, why does consciousness want to perceive reality without its center? The answer is because it's interested in seeing what it's like to have a center. It's seeing what it's like to be the center. It's interested in being the center, the central focus. Pleasure comes here. Bring the pleasure here. Bring the experience here. And then if you push the question further and say, why does consciousness want to have that experience? That's where you can't answer why. Because now you're talking about what somebody wants or likes or prefers, and preferences are not necessarily the outcome of logical choices. Preferences are the outcome of taste, which is the outcome of character, which is just the inherent nature of a thing. And so that's why there's no answer. There's no why answer. The answer is it's just a preference. It's a preference. Some consciousness wants to be this way because it can want that. Some want it. And then Graziella Ferraz, I'm sorry with the name. Fear on some level protects you. Actually, I don't think fear protects you. You got to get rid of... I don't think we should sanctify fear. Fear is a negative thing. Fear doesn't protect you. Fear makes you make bad decisions. Yeah. You should be aware. Does fear protect you? Okay. All right, let me change my attitude with this. So let's say it like this. Depending on what your attachment is, fear will grow off of that. So if your attachments are, your fear can protect your attachment. But really, you don't. I think it's not a great way to live. And I think you should put a difference between fear. There's a difference between fear and wisdom. So, for example, I don't go out into public without a mask. I wouldn't say that's because I'm scared. I would say that's because I'm smart. I don't have like a fear of coronavirus. I just don't want to get it. So I think when I hear the word fear, I think it's close to phobia. Maybe I'm wrong. Like, if you're afraid of walking alone at night in a bad neighborhood, why be afraid of it? You should just know that it's not good to walk alone at night in a bad neighborhood. Does consciousness have a choice to never manifest an objective world? That's called Brahman. It just remains latent. Yes. I think you guys are right, and I think I'm also right. I think you're right. Fear does serve a purpose. But I think I'm also right. So either way that you think about fear, it can be productive. If you think about fear as well serves a purpose, then great. Have it serve a good purpose. Be fearful of forgetting Bhagavan. Be fearful of never understanding the Bhagavatam. Be fearful of good things, of correct things. But the other way of looking at it is just as valid, is that fear is not useful. Why have fear? Fear is based on ignorance. Get rid of fear. Fear is debilitating. You should rather have positive thing. The positive thing, like for example, the desire to be safe, is better than the fear of being attacked. And if it will produce the same outcome. Anyway, I think this is a little bit of a distraction, but maybe it's interesting. But anyway, you can look at it either way you want. Okay, guys. I shall sign off now. Thank you very much for your company this morning.